They mocked his tough guy characters as toxic masculinity, suggesting his films promoted outdated values. His answer drew from decades of life experience, revealing wisdom the smug hosts couldn't begin to challenge. Liberal TV hosts thought he could mock Sylvester Stallone, but his brilliant response left the entire studio completely silent. What happened next changed how millions view Hollywood forever. The incident happened during what should have been just another episode of cultural commentary, the award-winning talk show known for its intellectual discussions, witty takedowns, and smug dismissals of anything deemed too mainstream, too commercial, too American for its elite audience. The show had built its reputation on elevating the obscure, celebrating the foreign and experimental, while looking down on popular entertainment with barely disguised contempt. The kind of show where guests quoted French philosophers, discussed avant-garde exhibitions, and competed to demonstrate their cultural superiority with each carefully crafted observation. Sylvester Stallone was never supposed to be there, not in that world, not in that space. The action star behind Rocky and Rambo represented everything the show typically ridiculed. Commercial success over artistic merit, American swagger over European subtlety, mass appeal over critical acclaim. But the ratings had been slipping, viewership declining week after week as audiences tired of the same predictable conversations, the same narrow definition of culture, the same guests saying the same things to the same approving nods. Something needed to change, and someone had suggested Stallone, not because they respected his work, but because they saw an opportunity. A chance to boost ratings through contrast, through planned discomfort, through subtle mockery. What better way to reassert the show's intellectual credentials than by highlighting the gulf between high culture and Hollywood entertainment, between thoughtful discourse and action spectacle, between their world and his? The host, Marcus Bennett, had smirked when the suggestion was first made, his eyes lighting up with possibilities for verbal traps, subtle jabs, intellectual ambushes that would leave Stallone exposed as exactly what they all assumed him to be, a muscle-bound relic, unable to keep up with their rapid-fire cultural references, their subtle literary allusions, their political sophistication. "Yes," Bennett had said, "let's book him." And the trap was set. The stage was designed for maximum contrast, the usual warm lighting replaced by something cooler, more clinical, more museum than living room, the background shelves filled with carefully selected books, award-winning novels, philosophical treatises, political manifestos in multiple languages, a visual reminder of the intellectual firepower Bennett and his regular guests wielded so effortlessly. The audience that night was their usual crowd: academics, journalists, artists, critics, people who took pride in their cultural discernment, their ability to separate worthwhile from worthless, meaningful from merely popular. They had come, expecting entertainment, but not from Stallone himself, rather from watching Bennett dismantle him, expose the gulf between true artistry and commercial Hollywood spectacle. It would be civilized, of course. No crude takedowns, no obvious disrespect, just the sophisticated mockery of subtle questions designed to reveal limitations, of carefully chosen topics guaranteed to exclude, of inside references meant to confuse, the kind of intellectual belittlement that leaves no visible wounds but achieves its purpose nonetheless. The producers had briefed Bennett thoroughly. Stallone's background, his career, his interviews, identifying potential weaknesses, areas of ignorance, topics that might trip him up or shut him down. They had crafted questions that seemed respectful on the surface, but contained hidden traps, subtle provocations, opportunities for Bennett to demonstrate his superiority without appearing explicitly rude. In the green room, Stallone waited quietly, dressed simply in a dark shirt and jacket, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress, just comfortable, practical, appropriate. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing at the monitor. showing the current segment where Bennett and his regular panelists were discussing obscure European cinema with the practiced enthusiasm of connoisseurs sharing insights inaccessible to ordinary viewers. A production assistant approached nervously. "5 minutes, Mr. Stallone." He nodded, offered a small smile which seemed to surprise her. Perhaps she had expected something else, more ego, more Hollywood, more Stallone. But the man sitting there seemed calm, contemplative, almost serene, not at all bothered by the environment he was about to enter or the reception he was likely to receive. In the control room, the director spoke quietly into his headset, preparing the technical team for the upcoming segment. "Get multiple angles on Bennett's reactions," he instructed. "They'll be gold. This is going to be a masterclass in contrast." An assistant producer nearby nodded in agreement, adding, "I can already see the clips going viral, Stallone trying to keep up with Bennett's references." The audience laughed as Bennett finished his current segment with a particularly cutting observation about American cinema's lack of substance, the perfect segue to their next guest. He shuffled his notes briefly, a practiced gesture that signaled to regular viewers a transition to something new, something potentially entertaining. "Our next guest comes from a very different world," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated respect that masked subtle mockery. "He's known worldwide for his action films, the Rocky and Rambo franchises in particular, which have grossed billions at the box office, if not quite the same amount in critical acclaim." A ripple of knowing laughter spread through the audience. The first jab landed perfectly, establishing the tone for what was to come. "Please welcome Sylvester Stallone." The applause was polite, controlled, the kind given out of obligation, rather than enthusiasm, as Stallone walked onto the set, his movements measured, deliberate, unhurried, nothing like the characters he portrayed on screen. He shook Bennett's hand firmly, but without aggression, nodded to the audience without performing for them, then took his seat, arms relaxed, expression neutral, not defensive, not eager to please, just present, observant, aware. Bennett leaned forward slightly, a predator preparing to toy with prey. "Sylvester, or do you prefer Sly?" He began with practiced casualness. "Thanks for joining us on Cultural Commentary. We don't often have guests from your particular sphere of the entertainment world." The subtle emphasis on particular, another small jab, establishing distance, creating separation between their worlds. Stallone nodded. "Thank you for having me." His voice deeper, quieter than his screen presence, carrying none of the defensive edge Bennett had hoped to provoke. Bennett pressed on undeterred. "Your films have certainly made an impression on popular culture over the last few decades," he said with a slight smile, "though I'm curious how you view your own work in the broader context of cinematic history. Do you see it as pure entertainment, or do you believe there's something more substantive there?" The question seemed innocent enough on the surface, but contained its own conclusion, its own assumption about the answer, as though the very idea of Rocky or Rambo having artistic merit was slightly absurd. The audience leaned forward slightly, anticipating Stallone's struggle to articulate a defensive work they'd already dismissed. Bennett's expression remained fixed in that smile, the one he reserved for moments like these, when he'd set a trap that couldn't be escaped, when he'd posed a question that couldn't be answered without confirming his own biases. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the trap had been recognized before it was sprung, that the question's design had been noted, understood, analyzed by the man they had all underestimated, by the man whose life had been defined by being underestimated and proving everyone wrong. Stallone looked at Bennett directly, his gaze steady, calm, unintimidated. A silence stretched between them for 2 seconds, long enough to create anticipation, but not discomfort. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, thoughtful, precise. Not at all what anyone in that studio had expected, not at all aligned with the caricature they had all agreed he must surely be. "I think that's a fascinating question, Marcus," he began, his tone conversational, "and one that gets to the heart of how we define art, how we separate entertainment from meaning, and who gets to make those distinctions in the first place." Bennett blinked just once, a momentary break in his practiced expression, the first hairline crack in the facade, the first sign that this interview might not follow the comfortable script he had so carefully prepared. And that's when everything started to change. The studio of cultural commentary was designed to intimidate through sophistication, every element carefully selected to communicate intellectual superiority. The set resembled a modernist living room that no one actually lived in. Sleek furniture, in muted colors arranged at precise angles, bookshelves filled with award-winning literature, none with creased spines or dog-eared pages, just pristine volumes selected for visual impact, more prop than passion. The lighting cast a cool blue-tinged glow, unlike the warm tones of typical talk shows, creating an atmosphere more gallery than conversation, more exhibition than exchange. Even the temperature was deliberately maintained several degrees cooler than comfortable, keeping guests slightly on edge, slightly less than relaxed. The audience sat in tiered seating, creating the impression of judgment from above, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the stage lights reflecting off polished surfaces, many wearing expressions of studied seriousness, the practiced looks of people accustomed to nodding at the right moments, laughing at the right references, signaling their membership in a cultural elite through perfectly timed reactions. Behind the cameras, crew members moved with practiced efficiency, dressed entirely in black like stagehands at an avant-garde theater, their movements choreographed to remain unseen while capturing every nuance of the constructed reality playing out before the viewers at home. Monitors glowed in the darkness beyond the set, displaying multiple camera angles, close-ups of expressions, reactions, gestures, carefully selected to tell the story the producers had already decided upon. The control room hummed with low voices, directors, producers, technical staff, watching the screens with professional detachment, occasionally whispering instructions into headsets, guiding the visual narrative with invisible hands, making sure every moment conveyed exactly what they intended it to convey. The show's signature theme music faded, a minimalist piano composition that suggested intellectual depth through carefully measured restraint. The kind of music that announced, "This is not entertainment, this is culture." As Bennett adjusted his position in the modernist chair, designed more for appearance than comfort, his body language shifted subtly from conversational to confrontational, the slight forward lean, the narrowed focus, the performance of intellectual curiosity that masked something less generous, something more predatory. The studio lights seemed to intensify slightly, focusing attention on the two men, creating a visual contrast between them. Bennett, in his carefully selected attire, charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, the uniform of the cultural commentator, signaling seriousness, purpose, intellectual intent, a deliberate rejection of frivolity or flash. Stallone in simpler attire, dark shirt open at the collar, well-cut jacket, comfortable yet appropriate, neither trying to impress nor to rebel, just a man comfortable in his own skin. The camera caught this contrast perfectly, framing them as representatives of different worlds, different approaches, different values, the intellectual and the physical, the critic and the creator, the judge and the judged. At least that was the intended framing, the narrative they had planned to construct. But something in Stallone's posture, in his calm, measured presence, refused to play the assigned role, refused to appear diminished by the surroundings, by the atmosphere, by the subtle cues designed to establish hierarchy. In the front row, a critic from an influential arts magazine leaned toward his companion, whispering something that made them both smile with anticipation. They had come for the spectacle, for the intellectual blood sport, for the satisfaction. of seeing popular culture put properly in its place, below their notice, beneath their consideration. The overhead lights cast subtle shadows across Bennett's angular features, highlighting the sharpness of his gaze, the practiced intensity of his expression, while Stallone sat in the adjacent chair, more fully illuminated, less shadowed, his features more open, more present, creating a visual dynamic the producers hadn't planned, one that subtly undermined their intended narrative even before a word was spoken. Behind the scenes, a production assistant hurried past, carrying fresh water for the host, none offered to the guest, a small detail but telling of the hierarchy embedded in the show's operation. The studio audience settled into expectant silence. As Bennett began his questioning, the atmosphere charged with anticipation for the intellectual spectacle about to unfold. A cameraman adjusted his focus, zooming in slightly on Stallone's face, ready to capture any sign of confusion, any moment of hesitation, any evidence that would confirm what everyone in that room already believed about the man behind Rocky and Rambo. From the control room, the director spoke quietly into his headset. Get ready for reaction shots from the audience when Stallone struggles. The assumption so embedded, no one questioned whether he would, only when and how dramatically. Microphones, positioned strategically around the set, captured every sound, every subtle shift, every breath between words, creating an acoustic intimacy that made viewers feel present, witnesses to the conversation, even as that conversation was being carefully shaped, crafted, directed toward a predetermined conclusion. Bennett's microphone was set slightly louder, Stallone's slightly softer, another subtle technical choice reinforcing who should command attention, whose words carried more weight, whose perspective was meant to dominate. Around the edges of the set, assistants and producers watched intently, clipboards in hand, notes at the ready, prepared to offer Bennett additional questions, points of attack, alternate angles should his initial approach fail to yield the desired result. All of this machinery of modern television, invisible to the casual viewer, but essential to constructing the reality they were meant to perceive, the reality of intellectual hierarchy, of cultural stratification, of who belonged and who did not in the rarefied air of cultural commentary. A production assistant signaled silently from offstage, indicating to Bennett that social media was already responding to the segment, anticipating the clash of worlds, the confrontation of values, the intellectual versus the physical, the critic versus the creator. Bennett acknowledged with the slightest nod, professional enough to maintain his focus on the conversation while remaining aware of the broader performance taking place for multiple audiences across multiple platforms. Stallone noticed this exchange, his eyes briefly tracking the silent communication before returning to Bennett, missing nothing, absorbing everything, more observant than anyone had expected, more aware than anyone had credited. The soundproofed walls of the studio kept the outside world at bay, creating a sealed environment where reality could be carefully controlled, managed, directed toward the desired outcome, where narratives could be constructed without interference, from alternate perspectives, without challenge from different voices. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the subtle buzz of electronics, the quiet rustle of audience members shifting in their seats, all created a sonic backdrop against which the conversation played out, like instruments in a carefully arranged composition, all serving the central melody, all supporting the intended theme. Bennett cleared his throat slightly, a practiced gesture signaling transition from pleasantries to substance, from welcome to examination, from host to inquisitor. Sylvester, your character Rocky Balboa has become a cultural icon of sorts, he said, his tone suggesting both acknowledgement and subtle qualification. A working-class hero for a certain demographic, the slight emphasis on certain creating immediate distance, categorization, limitation. I'm curious what you think that says about American audiences, their tastes, their values. The question itself contained assumptions, embedded judgments, unspoken conclusions. It wasn't really a question at all, but a statement wrapped in interrogative form. An invitation not to explain, but to confirm what Bennett and his audience already believed about popular entertainment and those who consumed it. The camera zoomed in on Stallone's face, catching his expression in close detail, looking for the reaction they expected, the defensiveness, the discomfort, the struggle, to articulate against a framework designed to diminish. But what they captured instead was something entirely different, something they hadn't planned for, hadn't expected, couldn't immediately categorize. A calm, thoughtful assessment of the questioner, the question and its intent, a recognition of the terrain, a reading of the battlefield before any response was offered, before any words were spoken. Stallone's eyes met Bennett's directly, not challenging, not defensive, not intimidated, simply present, aware, engaged. And in that moment, though no one yet realized it, the dynamic began to shift, imperceptibly at first, like the first subtle movement of tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface before the earthquake that changes everything. Marcus Bennett wasn't just a talk show host. He was a cultural gatekeeper, a man who had built his career on distinguishing between worthy and worthless, on separating art from entertainment, substance from spectacle. At 47, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having his taste questioned, his opinions challenged, his authority disputed, his angular features and perpetually arched eyebrow conveying constant evaluation, judgment, assessment. His wire-rimmed glasses and meticulously maintained salt and pepper beard, projecting precisely the image of intellectual heft he had cultivated over 2 decades in cultural criticism. He had started in print media, writing scathing reviews of popular films, celebrating obscure foreign directors, establishing his credentials as someone who understood culture on a deeper level than the masses who consumed it unthinkingly. His transition to television had been seamless, his cutting observations and sardonic delivery perfect. For a medium that rewarded performance over substance, spectacle over depth, the very qualities he claimed to despise in the entertainment he so frequently dismissed, the irony was lost on him entirely. Cultural commentary had made him famous, not Hollywood famous, not mass-market famous, but famous within the circles that mattered to him, the critics, the academics, the coastal elites who saw in Bennett a champion of their values, their tastes, their sense of cultural superiority. He interviewed authors most people had never read, filmmakers whose work rarely screened in multiplexes, musicians who rejected commercial success as evidence of artistic compromise. He celebrated difficulty, complexity, obscurity as virtues in themselves, regardless of whether they served any purpose beyond excluding the uninitiated. His interview style was a carefully constructed performance, beginning with seemingly respectful questions that contained hidden traps, implicit judgments, building to moments of intellectual ambush where he would expose contradictions, weaknesses, flaws in his guests' arguments, positions, creations, always maintaining the veneer of civility, the appearance of fair-minded inquiry, while executing the intellectual equivalent of public executions for his audience's satisfaction. Tonight he wore his signature outfit, the critic's uniform of black turtleneck and blazer, desaturated colors to signal seriousness of purpose, a deliberate rejection of flash, style, individuality, the very elements he claimed to value in art, but rejected in his own self-presentation. His posture was perfect, his movements precise, everything calculated for maximum effect, minimum emotional revelation. Control was his defining characteristic, control of the conversation, the narrative, the framing, control of how culture was discussed, defined, evaluated on his show, in his space, under his authority. Seated across from him, Sylvester Stallone presented a stark contrast in every conceivable dimension. Where Bennett was all angles and sharp edges, Stallone at 76 carried the solid presence of someone who had built himself physically, mentally, spiritually. Through decades of discipline, determination, reinvention, his face bore the evidence of his journey, the slight droop on one side from a birth complication, the subtle scars from countless fights both real and staged, the lived-in quality of someone who had experienced, rather than merely observed, analyzed, categorized. His hands resting lightly on the chair arms were those of a man who had worked with them, created with them, built with them, not just signed books or gestured for emphasis during intellectual discussions about other people's creations. He wore a simple dark shirt and well-cut jacket, neither flamboyant nor deliberately understated, just appropriate, practical, comfortable, the clothes of someone who didn't need his wardrobe to establish his identity, who didn't require external markers to signal his place in the world. Bennett saw only the surface, the action star, the muscle-bound hero, the creator of popular entertainment that critics like himself had dismissed for decades as simplistic, commercial, unsophisticated. He failed to see what lay beneath: the writer, director, producer who had created enduring characters, written dialogue quoted across generations, crafted stories that resonated with millions across cultural and linguistic boundaries. He failed to see the man who had started with nothing, rejected by studios, agents, producers, who had believed so deeply in his vision. He had refused to sell his script for Rocky unless he could play the lead role, despite being broke, unknown, unconnected. He failed to see the artistic commitment behind the commercial success, the vision behind the popularity, the substance behind the spectacle. This blindness, this fundamental misreading, was evident in every aspect of his demeanor: the slightly condescending tone, the questions framed to diminish rather than explore, the subtle physical cues that established hierarchy: leaning forward slightly when speaking, leaning back when listening, indicating the relative importance he assigned to each side of the conversation. The audience mirrored his perspective, their expressions conveying the same mixture of intellectual superiority and cultural dismissal. They had come to witness an intellectual dissection, a skillful dismantling of popular culture through its seemingly perfect representative, the muscled hero of simplistic moral narratives where good triumphed over evil through physical rather than intellectual means. A producer watched from just off camera, clipboard in hand, notes at the ready. She had been with the show since its beginning, had witnessed hundreds of these interviews, seen Bennett reduce authors, filmmakers, musicians to stammering, defensive. Rex, with his precise intellectual dissection, she expected. "What do you mean by that exactly?" Bennett asked, his tone shifting slightly, the practiced ease giving way to something more pointed, more alert, more aware of potential challenge. Stallone leaned back slightly in his chair, a subtle movement that claimed space rather than surrendered it. "Well, when critics describe Rocky or Rambo as simplistic," he replied, his voice remaining conversational, "they're often viewing these characters through a specific lens that prioritizes verbal complexity over nothing different tonight, perhaps an even more dramatic demolition given the perceived intellectual gulf between host and guest." In the front row, a literary critic who had appeared on the show dozens of times leaned forward in anticipation, expecting the usual satisfying spectacle of high culture triumphing over low, of complexity defeating simplicity, of intellect dominating physicality. Bennett shifted slightly in his chair, the movement of a predator preparing to strike. The preliminary questions completed, the pleasantries exhausted. Now the real interview would begin. Now the true purpose would reveal itself. "Let's talk about your films, Sylvester," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated interest that masked condescension. specifically their portrayal of masculinity, which many critics have described as simplistic, outdated, even problematic in today's more nuanced cultural context. The question hung in the air, not really a question at all, but a statement crafted to provoke, to diminish, to establish intellectual dominance through implication rather than direct challenge. The audience responded with subtle shifts, leaning forward slightly, anticipating Stallone's struggle to engage with concepts they assumed were beyond his grasp, expecting the intellectual equivalent of watching someone drown in deep waters. Bennett maintained his expression of polite interest, the practiced look of someone extending courtesy while expecting disappointment. The camera zoomed in slightly on Stallone's face, ready to capture the moment of realization, the dawning awareness of being intellectually outmatched. The defensive reaction the producers anticipated would make perfect viral content, validate their audience's assumptions, reinforce Bennett's cultural authority. But Stallone's expression didn't change. No widening of eyes, no tightening of jaw, no shifting in his seat, no clearing of throat, none of the tells that signaled discomfort, concern, awareness of being ambushed. Instead, he remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly present, considering not how to escape the trap, but whether it was worth addressing at all, whether the framework itself deserved legitimacy through his engagement with it. The silence extended just long enough to be noticeable, uncomfortable, the kind of pause that television producers dread, that disrupts rhythm, pacing, flow, that creates unpredictable moments networks simultaneously fear and crave. Bennett's expression flickered briefly, a momentary uncertainty quickly suppressed. He was accustomed to guests filling silences, rushing to defend themselves, explain themselves against his carefully crafted provocations. This calm assessment, this unhurried consideration was something new, something unexpected, something that subtly challenged the power dynamic he had established across hundreds of previous interviews. When Stallone finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful, direct, carrying none of the defensive energy, none of the insecurity, none of the need to prove himself that Bennett had anticipated. "That's an interesting framing, Marcus," he said, his eyes meeting Bennett's directly, "but I wonder if it reveals more about the critics than about the films themselves." The statement landed with unexpected impact, not aggressive, not defensive, not dismissive, but gently turning the lens around, examining the examiner, questioning the question, suggesting an alternate perspective that Bennett hadn't anticipated, hadn't prepared for, hadn't considered. In the control room, the director blinked, exchanged glances with the producer beside him. This wasn't the response they had expected, not the beginning of the narrative they had planned to construct, not the dynamic they had intended to establish. Something was happening, something unscripted, something potentially more interesting but far less controlled than their usual fare. And as Bennett shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair, recalibrating his approach, reassessing his strategy, the power dynamic in the studio began to shift, imperceptibly at first, but undeniably, like the first subtle change in atmospheric pressure before a storm that transforms the landscape. Physical expression, intellectual conflict over personal struggle. The audience stirred slightly. This wasn't the defensive response they had expected, not the stammering justification, not the commercial artist trying desperately to claim deeper meaning in popular entertainment. This was something else entirely, a calm assessment of critical frameworks themselves. Bennett's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, professional enough to maintain his expression, experienced enough to recognize when an interview wasn't following the comfortable script he had prepared. "I think most serious critics," he countered, emphasizing serious, would argue that your films, particularly the Rambo series, glorify violence, militarism, American exceptionalism at the expense of nuance, complexity, moral ambiguity, the qualities that define truly significant art. Again, the statement masquerading as question, Again, the implied hierarchy of values. Again, the attempt to force Stallone into defending himself against a framework designed to diminish his work regardless of response. The camera captured it all. Bennett's slightly forward lean, the subtle shift in his tone, the first signs of a host moving from performative curiosity to intellectual challenge. A panelist seated nearby, a film professor from an elite university, nodded in agreement, adding credibility to Bennett's framing, reinforcing the consensus the show had constructed about what constituted worthy cultural expression and what remained outside those boundaries. Stallone nodded slightly. Acknowledgement, not agreement. "Have you watched the first Rambo film recently, Marcus?" he asked, his question direct but not confrontational. Bennett blinked, caught momentarily off guard by the unexpected redirection. "I've seen it, yes," he replied, his tone suggesting the viewing had been more obligation than interest, more research than engagement. Stallone's expression remained thoughtful. "It's interesting you mention moral ambiguity," he said, "because First Blood is fundamentally about a Vietnam veteran, traumatized by war, rejected by his country, pushed to breaking point by systemic failure. It's hardly a celebration of American militarism, if anything. It's a profound critique." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some exchanged glances. Others shifted in their seats. This wasn't the conversation they had anticipated. Not the validation of cultural hierarchy they had come to witness. Bennett recovered quickly, adapting as professionals must. While the first film might have had those elements, he countered dismissively, the sequels clearly devolved into jingoistic action spectacles, with Rambo literally returning to Vietnam. To refight and win a war America had lost. The implication clear, the concession insignificant, the underlying judgment unchanged. Stallone remained unruffled. "That's a common perspective," he acknowledged, his tone neither defensive nor confrontational, "but I'd suggest it overlooks the context, both of the films themselves and the era in which they were made." Bennett sensed an opening, a chance to regain control. "Please enlighten us," he said, unable to keep a subtle edge of sarcasm from creeping into his voice. The shift in tone was slight but unmistakable, the pretense of genuine curiosity giving way to intellectual challenge, the performance of respectful engagement, revealing its true nature. Stallone either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge the change in Bennett's demeanor. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, engaged. "When we made Rambo 2 and 3, the Soviet Union still existed. The Cold War was ongoing, and thousands of American POWs were still unaccounted for in Southeast Asia. The films weren't just action spectacles. They were addressing real concerns, real cultural anxieties, real historical wounds that many Americans were grappling with." Bennett's expression tightened slightly, his patience for this explanation visibly thinning. "So you're claiming these were actually political films, not just commercial entertainments designed to sell tickets through explosions and body counts?" His tone now openly skeptical, the pretense of neutral inquiry abandoned in favor of direct challenge. The control room watched with growing interest. This wasn't the standard Bennett interview, not the usual intellectual dissection where guests stumbled through inadequate defenses of positions Bennett had already decided were indefensible. This was becoming an actual conversation, an actual debate about artistic intent, cultural context, historical significance, topics the show claimed to value but rarely explored with genuine openness. Stallone met Bennett's gaze directly. "I'm saying the distinction you're making between political art and commercial entertainment might be less clear than you suggest." The audience stirred again, louder this time, some leaning forward with unexpected interest, others exchanging glances of surprise. This was not Sylvester Stallone as they had imagined him, not the muscle-bound action hero struggling to articulate beyond monosyllabic expressions of physical determination. This was someone engaging directly with critical frameworks, cultural assumptions, historical context, with unexpected eloquence and insight. Bennett felt the shift in the room's energy. Professional that he was, he recognized when an interview was veering from its intended direction, its planned outcome, when his authority as cultural arbiter was being subtly challenged not through confrontation, but through calm, reasoned engagement with the very ideas he claimed to champion. He needed to regain control, re-establish the hierarchy, redirect the conversation back to safer ground, where his expertise, his perspective, his judgment remained unquestioned. "Let's talk about Rocky then," he said, pivoting abruptly to a new topic, a film that, while enormously popular, has been criticized for its simplistic rags-to-riches narrative, its reinforcement of individualistic myths that ignore systemic barriers to success. The question carried the same embedded assumptions, the same implied judgment, the same attempt to force Stallone into a defensive position where any response would validate the premise that popular entertainment lacked serious artistic merit. The panelist beside Bennett nodded again, adding with studied casualness, and of course its rather problematic portrayal of race, particularly with the Apollo Creed character. Bennett seized on this immediately. "Yes, the racial dynamics in the Rocky films have been extensively critiqued," he said, turning back to Stallone, the white working-class hero triumphing over the flamboyant black champion. "It's not difficult to see the troubling subtexts there. The trap was set again, more explicitly this time. The accusation more direct, more damaging. Stallone was being asked to defend not just the artistic merit of his work, but its moral character, its ethical implications, its political dimensions. The audience watched with renewed attention, some leaning forward in anticipation of witnessing Stallone's struggle to respond to allegations that had become accepted wisdom in certain critical circles, regardless of their correspondence to actual content, actual intent, actual impact. The cameraman zoomed in on Stallone's face, catching his expression in close detail, looking for signs of discomfort, defensiveness, anger, any reaction that would confirm what they already believed about him, about his work, about the gulf. Between commercial entertainment and serious art, Stallone's expression remained calm, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of something deeper, more intense. Not anger, not frustration, not defensiveness, but a quiet, determined recognition of the game being played and the stakes involved. When he spoke, his voice remained measured but carried a new intensity, a new purpose that commanded attention without demanding it. "Have you ever spoken with Carl Weathers about Apollo Creed?" he asked, his question direct, specific, unexpected. Bennett blinked, caught off guard again by the redirection, the specificity, the implication. "No, I haven't," he admitted, his tone suggesting the conversation would have been of limited interest or value. Stallone nodded slightly. "Carl and I spent months developing that character," he said, his gaze steady, making sure Apollo Creed was portrayed not as a stereotype or a villain, but as a champion, a businessman, an athlete, who was just as dedicated, just as professional, just as worthy of respect as Rocky himself. The control room fell silent, producers watching monitors with increased interest. This wasn't going according to plan, the intended narrative unraveling in real time, replaced by something unscripted, unpredictable, potentially more compelling but far less controlled than their usual fare. Bennett shifted in his chair again, recalibrating his approach, his expression a complex mixture of professional focus and growing awareness that this interview was not proceeding as he had anticipated, not yielding the results he had expected, not reinforcing the cultural hierarchy he had built his career upon. "Sylvester, with all due respect," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that signaled no actual respect, was forthcoming. "Creative intentions aside, the impact of these films, their cultural footprint, their influence cannot be separated from the problematic elements, the racial, Stereotypes, the gender representations, the glorification of violence, individualism, nationalism at the expense of nuance, complexity, moral ambiguity. It was a comprehensive dismissal, a complete rejection of Stallone's work, its value, its meaning, its significance, delivered with the confident finality of someone unaccustomed to having his judgments questioned, his pronouncements challenged, his authority disputed. Stallone looked at Bennett for a long moment, neither defensive nor intimidated nor angry, just thoughtfully considering the man before him, the perspective he represented, the framework he employed. Then, with calm deliberation, he responded with words that would change the entire dynamic of the interview, the show, the evening itself, in ways no one in that studio had anticipated. Silence fell over the studio, a heavy, tangible silence that seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone present. Stallone didn't immediately respond to Bennett's dismissive assessment. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, composed, revealing nothing of what might be happening beneath the surface. The audience shifted slightly, some leaning forward in anticipation, others exchanging glances of uncertainty. The expected pattern had been disruption. They had seen countless times before guests responding immediately, defensively to Bennett's provocations, his challenges, his dismissals, rushing to justify, explain, defend against his cultural pronouncements. But Stallone simply sat there, considering not just the words themselves, but the intent behind them, the framework supporting them, the assumptions embedded within them. The seconds stretched uncomfortably, 3, 4, 5, an eternity in television time, where silence was the enemy, empty air, the ultimate sin. A production assistant in the wings made a subtle gesture suggesting they might need to cut to commercial if this continued, but Bennett held up his hand slightly, professional enough to recognize that this moment, whatever it was becoming, should be allowed to play out. The camera remained focused on Stallone's face, capturing his expression in intimate detail, the slight crease between his brows, not of confusion or distress, but of thoughtful consideration. The steady gaze, neither intimidated nor aggressive, just present, aware, engaged. The room's energy shifted subtly, the anticipation of intellectual blood sport giving way to something more uncertain, more unpredictable, more authentic than the carefully constructed confrontations that typically defined cultural commentary. 7 seconds now, 8. The silence extending beyond uncomfortable into something almost reverent, as though the studio itself were holding its breath, waiting for something no one could quite anticipate. Bennett shifted slightly in his chair, the movement betraying a hint of uncertainty. He was accustomed to controlling the rhythm, the pace, the flow of conversation, to filling silences with his own observations, his own framings, his own conclusions. But something told him that interrupting this particular silence would be a mistake, a miscalculation, a revelation of weakness rather than strength. So he waited, though the waiting itself was foreign to his nature, his practice, his persona. In the control room, producers exchanged glances of concern. This wasn't television as they understood it, not the rapid exchanges, the clever retorts, the emotional reactions that drove engagement. This was something slower, more deliberate, more thoughtful than their format typically allowed. Yet something prevented them from intervening, from cutting to commercial, from forcing movement, perhaps curiosity, perhaps intuition, perhaps recognition that something unusual, something potentially compelling was unfolding before them. The audience remained perfectly still, collectively holding their breath. Many had come expecting entertainment through intellectual domination, through the satisfying spectacle of popular culture being put in its place by their appointed champion. Of highbrow standards, now they found themselves witnesses to something they hadn't anticipated, couldn't quite categorize, couldn't immediately judge. 10 seconds now. 11, an age in broadcast terms, a lifetime in interview dynamics. Bennett's expression remained fixed, his professional mask holding firm, but his eyes revealed the first flickers of uncertainty, concern, recalculation. As the silence continued to stretch beyond all conventional boundaries, Stallone's posture hadn't changed, his hands resting lightly on the chair arms, his breathing steady, even, unhurried. Nothing in his physical presence suggesting discomfort, anxiety, struggle, just calm, deliberate consideration of what had been said and what would follow. The film professor seated nearby glanced at Bennett, then back at Stallone, her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. This wasn't proceeding according to expectations, not following the familiar pattern of intellectual challenge and inadequate response that typically characterized the show's interviews with figures from popular entertainment. In the front row, the literary critic, who had anticipated witnessing another satisfying dismantling, now leaned forward with unexpected interest, sensing that something unscripted, something genuine, something potentially revealing was taking place before them. 12 seconds, 13. The silence becoming its own statement, its own response, its own challenge to the rapid-fire certainty, the confident dismissals, the unexamined assumptions that typically dominated these conversations about culture, art, meaning, value. A production assistant checked her watch, made another subtle gesture toward the floor director, who shook his head slightly. Not yet, not now. Something was happening, something worth witnessing, something worth allowing to unfold in its own time, at its own pace, according to its own internal logic, rather than the artificial constraints of broadcast segments, commercial breaks, audience attention spans. 14 seconds. 15. Bennett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle tell that the silence was affecting him, that the dynamic was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated, couldn't easily control, couldn't immediately incorporate into his understanding of how these encounters were supposed to proceed, how they were meant to end. The camera caught this minuscule change, this hairline crack in his professional composure, even as it remained focused primarily on Stallone's contemplative expression. 16 seconds, 17. Stallone finally moved slightly, a small adjustment. Of his posture, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a subtle shift indicating he was preparing to respond. The entire studio seemed to exhale collectively, a release of tension, anticipation, expectation that had built during the extended silence. Bennett leaned forward slightly, reasserting his presence, his authority, his control over the conversation that was about to resume, over the exchange that would follow, over the narrative that would emerge. Stallone met his gaze directly, his expression neither confrontational nor submissive, just present, genuine, engaged. The audience watched with rapt attention, sensing they were about to witness something different from what they had expected, different from what they had seen before, different from what they had been prepared by years of cultural conditioning to anticipate. When Stallone finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more measured, more deliberate, more focused, requiring everyone to listen more carefully, to attend more completely to what was being said. "That's an interesting perspective, Marcus," he began, his tone revealing neither anger nor offense, just thoughtful engagement with the ideas presented. "I wonder, though, if we might be approaching art, particularly popular art, from different angles." The statement was simple, direct, unadorned, yet it carried a weight, a presence, a substance that commanded attention without demanding it, that invited consideration without requiring agreement, that acknowledged difference without creating division. Bennett blinked just once, a momentary break in his practiced expression as he recalibrated his approach, his expectations, his understanding of the interview unfolding before him. In the control room, the director spoke quietly into his headset. "Keep the two-shot, let's see where this goes," recognizing that something unexpected was happening, something that defied their usual formulas, patterns, expectations, but something potentially more compelling than what they had planned to capture. Stallone continued, his voice remaining steady. When you speak of nuance, complexity, moral ambiguity, you're applying criteria that come from literary criticism, from academic analysis, from intellectual traditions that prioritize certain forms of expression over others. He paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, not for emphasis, just the natural rhythm of thoughtful conversation, allowing space for consideration, reflection, response. There's value in that approach, certainly, but it may not be the only valid way to evaluate stories that connect with millions of people across generations, cultures, languages. The audience stirred slightly, some leaning forward with unexpected interest, others exchanging glances of surprise. This wasn't Sylvester Stallone as they had imagined him, not the muscle-bound action hero struggling to defend simplistic narratives of physical triumph. This was someone engaging directly, thoughtfully, with fundamental questions of artistic evaluation, cultural hierarchy, aesthetic judgment, with unexpected eloquence, insight, perspective. Bennett's expression tightened slightly, professional enough to maintain composure, experienced enough to recognize when an interview wasn't proceeding according to comfortable, expected patterns, when his authority as cultural arbiter was being questioned not through confrontation, but through calm, reasoned engagement with the very ideas he claimed to champion. Are you suggesting that popularity is the... As the studio remained silent, Stallone's mind drifted briefly to a moment decades earlier that had shaped his understanding of art, criticism, elitism, and creativity, long before this confrontation, long before his success, long before Rocky, Rambo, fame and fortune. It was 1975. He was a struggling actor, almost completely broke, living in a small apartment so cold he had to wear his winter coat indoors, his wife pregnant, their future uncertain. He had just watched a boxing match between the great Muhammad Ali and a journeyman fighter named Chuck Wepner, who had managed, against all odds, to knock Ali down in the 9th round before eventually losing the fight. Something about that moment, that struggle, that unexpected challenge had triggered something in Stallone's imagination, and that night he had stayed up for 86 hours straight, fueled by desperation, inspiration, and determination, writing the screenplay that would become Rocky, pouring his own struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams into a character who wasn't expected to win, wasn't expected to succeed, wasn't expected to matter, but who fought anyway, who persevered anyway, who found dignity, meaning, and purpose in the struggle itself rather than the outcome. When he finished the script, he began shopping it to studios, receiving interest almost immediately, but with a catch. They wanted the script, but not him as the lead actor, and he was offered $25,000 for the screenplay, an enormous sum for someone who had less than $100 in his bank account, who was behind on rent, who couldn't afford proper food, heat, or electricity. The pressure to accept was overwhelming, the logical choice obvious, undeniable. Take the money, write another script, hope for a breakthrough later. But something deeper, something stronger, something more fundamental than logic told him to hold firm, to insist on playing the lead role himself, to risk everything on his own vision, his own ability, his own understanding of what the story meant, what it required, what it deserved. The studios increased their offer, $35,000, then $75,000, then $125,000, life-changing money that would have solved all his immediate problems, all his financial struggles. Finally, they offered $360,000, a fortune in 1975, an amount that would have transformed his circumstances completely. He refused again, insisted again, held firm again, and they relented eventually, allowed him to play Rocky Balboa, slashed the film's budget to minimize their risk, gave him his chance while hedging their bets against what they saw as his likely failure. The film, shot in 28 days on a shoestring budget, went on to earn $225 million worldwide, won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, spawned a franchise that continues to this day, became a cultural touchstone for generations who found in Rocky's struggle their own struggles, in his perseverance their own determination, in his dignity their own sense of worth. The critics had been divided, some seeing the raw, authentic power of a story told from genuine experience, others dismissing it as simplistic, formulaic, manipulative, unworthy of serious artistic consideration, despite its popular appeal. Because of its popular appeal, the same division, the same judgment, the same hierarchy that Bennett was applying now, decades later, from the same position of assumed superiority, the same perspective of cultural gatekeeping that Stallone had encountered throughout his career from people who studied art rather than created it, who analyzed expression rather than risked it, who judged work without understanding the blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice that went into bringing it into existence. The memory played through his mind in seconds, a brief flash of context, perspective, understanding that informed his response to Bennett's dismissal, that shaped his approach to this encounter, that grounded him in something more substantial than the artificial constructs of cultural hierarchy that dominated cultural commentary. He returned to the present, to the studio, the cameras, the audience, to Bennett waiting for his response, his expression a mixture of impatience, skepticism, the practiced look of someone accustomed to having the final measure of artistic merit, he asked, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, a defensive tone that revealed more than perhaps he intended about his own position. Stallone shook his head slightly. "Not at all," he replied. "What I'm suggesting is that different artistic traditions serve different purposes, speak to different needs, express different aspects of human experience. The physical, emotional, intuitive dimensions are no less valid, no less significant, no less meaningful than the intellectual, verbal, analytical dimensions you tend to prioritize. Authoritative word on matters of cultural significance, artistic merit." Stallone's expression remained thoughtful, neither intimidated nor aggressive nor defensive, just present, authentic, engaged. "When I wrote Rocky Bennett," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I had $106 in the bank. My wife was pregnant. I couldn't afford to heat my apartment. Studios offered me increasing amounts for the screenplay without me as the actor. Eventually $360,000, which was a fortune then." Bennett's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the response he had expected, not the defensive justification of artistic choices, not the insistence on deeper meaning in what he had already dismissed as simplistic entertainment, but a personal narrative, a human context that didn't fit neatly into his critical framework, his theoretical understanding, his intellectual categories. Stallone continued, his voice steady. "I turned it down repeatedly, insisted on playing the lead role myself, risked everything on that decision." The audience stirred slightly, some leaning forward with unexpected interest, others exchanging glances of surprise. This wasn't the conversation they had anticipated, not the intellectual sparring, the cultural posturing, the hierarchical reinforcement they had come to witness, but something more authentic, more human, more revealing about creativity, struggle, perseverance, about the actual lived experience behind the works they so casually judged. "The studios finally agreed," Stallone said, "because my asking price as an actor was so low. They slashed the budget, gave us 28 days to shoot, believed it would fail, disappear, be forgotten." Bennett shifted slightly in his chair, professional enough to appear interested, experienced enough to recognize that interrupting this narrative would appear dismissive, disrespectful, callous, even to his sympathetic audience, even to his cultural allies. "What they didn't understand," Stallone continued, "what perhaps critics still don't understand, is that Rocky wasn't about winning a fight. It was about finding dignity through struggle, about standing up when life knocks you down, about discovering your worth through effort, commitment, heart, not through victory, not through success, not through validation, but through the journey itself, the challenge itself, the fight itself. His expression remained calm, his tone measured, but something in his eyes conveyed the depth of conviction, the authenticity of experience, the earned wisdom that came from having lived the journey he was describing, not merely observed it, analyzed it, categorized it from safe intellectual distance. "I wonder sometimes," Stallone said, "if the division between high art and popular entertainment isn't primarily about accessibility, about whether creation connects directly with fundamental human experiences, emotions, struggles, or requires specialized education, context, training to be properly appreciated, understood, valued." The statement hung in the air, not as accusation, not as challenge, not as complaint, but as genuine reflection, genuine question, genuine inquiry into the nature of artistic hierarchies, cultural gatekeeping, aesthetic judgments that defined certain expressions as worthy and others as unworthy, based on criteria that were rarely examined, rarely questioned, rarely justified. Bennett's expression tightened slightly, recognizing that the conversation had shifted from his comfortable territory of authoritative pronouncement to the more uncertain ground of foundational questions that challenged the very basis of his critical approach, his professional identity, his cultural authority. But professional that he was, he recovered quickly, adapted smoothly. That's a rather convenient perspective for someone who has made millions creating what you yourself call accessible entertainment, he replied, his tone suggesting the observation settled the matter, revealed the motive, exposed the game. "I create what I understand," Stallone said simply, "stories that reflect struggles I've experienced, challenges I've faced, questions I've confronted in my own life, my own journey, my own search for meaning." The camera caught Bennett's reaction, the subtle shift in his expression, the momentary uncertainty quickly suppressed as he calculated his response, his approach, his strategy for regaining control of a conversation that had veered far from its intended course, its planned dynamic, its expected outcome. In the control room, producers watched with growing interest. This wasn't the standard Bennett interview, not the usual intellectual dissection, where guests stumbled through inadequate defenses of positions Bennett had already decided were indefensible. This was becoming an actual conversation, an actual exploration, an actual exchange about creativity, meaning, value, and judgment, topics the show claimed to prioritize but rarely engaged with genuine openness. "Have you ever created anything yourself, Marcus?" Stallone asked, his voice carrying no accusation, no challenge, no judgment, just genuine curiosity. Bennett blinked, caught momentarily off guard by the unexpected question, its directness, its implication. "I've written 3 books on cultural criticism," he replied, his tone suggesting this established his credentials beyond question, his authority beyond challenge, his perspective beyond dispute. Stallone nodded, acknowledging the response without dismissing or diminishing it. "I meant something creative," he clarified, his tone remaining conversational. "A novel, a screenplay, a painting, a sculpture, something that began as nothing, that required you to face the blank page, blank canvas, blank screen, and bring something new into existence." The clarification hung in the air, not as accusation, not as attack, not as judgment, but as a distinction between describing, analyzing, critiquing the creations of others and the vulnerable act of creating itself. The audience stirred slightly, some exchanging glances, others shifting positions, the question resonating beyond its immediate target to everyone present who had opinions about art, without having experienced the struggle of making it. The fear of failure, the risk of rejection, the courage required to share one's vision with the world. Bennett's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure I see the relevance," he replied, his tone dismissive, as though Stallone had introduced a tangent, a distraction, an irrelevance, rather than a fundamental question about the relationship between criticism and creation, between judgment and understanding, between observation and experience. Stallone's expression remained thoughtful, his tone neither confrontational nor defensive, just genuinely engaged with the question at hand. "I'm suggesting there's a difference," he said, "between analyzing art from an external position and understanding it from within the creative process. That doesn't invalidate criticism, but it might inform how we approach it, how we frame it, how we receive it." The camera caught Bennett's reaction, the subtle shift in his posture, his expression professional enough to maintain composure, experienced enough to recognize when a conversation had veered from its comfortable, familiar territory into something more challenging, more fundamental, more threatening to established hierarchies and assumptions about cultural authority. "I think this is getting rather philosophical," Bennett said with a tight smile, attempting to dismiss the line of questioning as abstract, irrelevant, impractical, rather than addressing its substance, its implications, its challenge to his position, authority, perspective. Stallone nodded slightly. "Isn't philosophy the foundation of critical thinking, critical judgment, critical analysis?" he asked, the question simple, direct, genuine, not rhetorical, not performative, not strategic, but a real inquiry into the connection between philosophical foundations and critical conclusions, judgments, pronouncements. In the control room, producers watched with growing interest. This wasn't just an interview gone off script. This was something more significant, more substantial, a fundamental questioning of the show's entire premise, its approach, its assumptions, its hierarchies, not through angry confrontation, not through defensive reaction, but through calm, thoughtful engagement with first principles, foundational questions that rarely surfaced in the rapid-fire judgments, the confident pronouncements, the intellectual posturing that typically defined cultural commentary. Bennett shifted in his chair again, recalibrating his approach, his strategy, his position, recognizing that standard techniques weren't yielding the expected results, weren't creating the anticipated dynamic, weren't reinforcing the established narrative about high culture versus low, art versus entertainment, about who had authority to determine value, meaning, significance in creative expression, cultural products, artistic endeavors. "Let's return to your films, Sylvester," he said, his tone carrying forced patience, as though humoring a digression before returning to the real subject, the proper focus, the legitimate topic of critique, analysis, judgment. "You mentioned earlier that Rocky was about dignity, about the struggle itself rather than the outcome. But isn't that precisely the kind of individualistic myth that distracts from systemic barriers to success, that suggests personal determination is sufficient, regardless of structural obstacles, inequalities, injustices?" It was another calculated question, containing its own conclusion, its own judgment, its own attempt to force Stallone into a defensive position, a political corner, a simplified characterization that would confirm Bennett's pre-existing assessment of his work, its meaning, its impact, its significance. Stallone considered the question, taking his time, not rushing to respond, not reacting to the provocative framing, but considering the substance beneath the presentation, the idea behind the strategy, the concept within the trap. When he finally spoke, his voice remained measured, his tone thoughtful, his manner genuine. "Do you think it's either or, Marcus?" he asked, rather than accepting the forced choice, the false dichotomy, the predetermined framework, either personal struggle or systemic barriers, either individual determination or structural obstacles, either inspiring stories of perseverance or critical analysis of social inequalities. The audience stirred again, some nodding slightly, others leaning forward. the conversation having shifted from entertainment to something more engaging, more substantial, more relevant than the intellectual performance they had expected, the predictable reinforcement of cultural hierarchy they had come to witness. Bennett's expression remained fixed, professional enough to maintain his composure, experienced enough to recognize when an interview wasn't proceeding according to comfortable, expected patterns. "I think stories that emphasize individual triumph," he replied without directly addressing Stallone's question, "often serve to reinforce myths about meritocracy that comfort the privileged while blaming the disadvantaged for their inability to overcome circumstances through sheer force of will, determination, character." It was classic Bennett, confident pronouncement, sweeping judgment, moral framing, delivered with the certainty of someone unaccustomed to having his perspective questioned, his assumptions challenged, his pronouncements disputed. Stallone nodded slightly, acknowledging the perspective without accepting the framework, the conclusion, the characterization. "I see it differently," he said, his voice steady. "I think stories of individual perseverance can acknowledge systemic obstacles while still affirming human dignity, agency, worth, even within difficult, even unfair circumstances." He paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, not for emphasis, just the natural rhythm of thoughtful conversation. Rocky doesn't triumph over systemic barriers. He doesn't become wealthy, powerful, influential through his determination, his effort, his heart. He simply maintains his dignity, his self-respect, his humanity in a world that had dismissed him as worthless. The audience was completely silent now, captivated by what had transformed from expected confrontation to unexpected insight. Bennett's expression tightened slightly, his body language shifting almost imperceptibly as he calculated his response. His approach, his strategy for regaining control of a conversation that had veered far from its intended course, its planned dynamic, its expected outcome. But Stallone continued, his voice remaining measured, his tone thoughtful, his manner neither aggressive nor defensive nor dismissive, just genuinely engaged with the ideas at hand, the questions that mattered, the substance beneath the surface. "Art doesn't have to choose, Marcus, between acknowledging systemic injustice and affirming human dignity, resilience, worth. It can hold both, recognize both, honor both. At their best, stories do precisely that. They show us the world as it is while reminding us of what we might become, despite everything, against everything, beyond everything that would diminish our humanity, our possibility, our potential." The statement hung in the air, not as challenge, not as rebuke, not as correction, but as perspective, as insight, as wisdom, earned through experience, struggle, creation, rather than derived from theory, analysis, criticism. The camera caught Bennett's reaction, the subtle shift in his expression, the momentary uncertainty quickly suppressed as he calculated his response, his approach, his strategy for addressing ideas that didn't fit neatly into the categories, the frameworks, the hierarchies that defined his critical approach, his professional identity, his cultural authority, his intellectual self-concept. The director in the control booth whispered to his assistant, "This is gold, don't cut away," sensing that the unexpected turn, the unplanned direction, the authentic exchange was potentially more valuable, more engaging, more meaningful than the manufactured confrontation they had anticipated, the intellectual spectacle they had planned to present. "Do you really believe, Stallone?" Bennett asked, his tone carrying a new edge, a new intensity, a new awareness of something significant at stake. "That popular entertainment, like your films, can address complex social issues, systemic inequalities, structural injustices with the same depth, nuance, insight as works created specifically to examine those questions, to challenge those systems, to transform those structures." It was another attempt at He pivoted again, adjusting his approach, his angle, his strategy. The difference, he said, his voice carrying that edge of someone justifying rather than explaining, is that critical analysis aims to illuminate, examine, question, not merely entertain, distract, confirm the biases, preconceptions, comfortable assumptions of mass audiences seeking simple narratives, clear heroes, easy answers to complex questions. It was another assertion of hierarchy, another claim of distinction, another reinforcement of categories that separated intellectual engagement from emotional response, critical perspective from popular appreciation, worthy expression from commercial product. Stallone remained unruffled, his expression thoughtful, his manner neither defensive nor aggressive, just genuinely engaged with the conversation, the ideas, the underlying assumptions that shaped cultural judgment, critical assessment, artistic valuation. "You know what's interesting, Marcus," he said, his voice quiet enough that everyone had to listen more carefully, attend more completely to what was being said, what was being offered, what was being examined without being attacked. "I've received thousands of letters over the years from people who found in Rocky or Rambo something beyond entertainment, beyond distraction, something that spoke to their struggles, their challenges, their search for meaning, dignity, purpose in difficult, often impossible circumstances." Bennett started to respond, to interrupt, to redirect. But Stallone continued, his voice steady, a man with terminal cancer who watched Rocky the night before his final treatment, finding courage he thought he'd lost. A woman who left an abusive relationship after seeing Adrian find her voice, her strength, her worth. A veteran with PTSD who felt seen, understood, acknowledged in Rambo's struggle to reintegrate, find peace, find home in a society that preferred to forget what it had asked him to do. The audience was completely silent now, captivated by what had transformed from intellectual debate to human testimony, from critical assessment to lived experience, from abstract discussion to concrete impact of work that critics had dismissed as simplistic, commercial, unworthy of serious consideration, serious analysis, serious respect. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The human dimension, the emotional resonance, the actual impact of Stallone's work on real people, real lives, real struggles not fitting neatly into his critical framework, his theoretical perspective, his intellectual categories, his hierarchical understanding of cultural value, artistic merit, creative significance. But Stallone wasn't finished, his expression remaining thoughtful, his tone measured, his manner neither boastful nor defensive, just honestly engaging with questions that mattered about art, meaning, purpose, connection. "I'm not suggesting these responses make my films great art, important art, significant art by the standards you apply, Marcus," he said, acknowledging. Rather than challenging the critical framework, the intellectual perspective, the hierarchical assessment Bennett represented, "I'm saying they connected with something human, something authentic, something meaningful in the lives of people seeking courage, hope, dignity in their own struggles, their own challenges, their own pain." The camera captured it all. Stallone's quiet certainty, his genuine engagement, his lack of defensiveness, his absence of need for validation, approval, acceptance from the cultural gatekeepers, the critical authorities, the self-appointed arbiters of artistic value, and Bennett's growing awareness that the conversation had shifted fundamentally from his comfortable territory of authoritative judgment to uncertain ground of questioning, examination, reflection on what art means, what criticism serves, what value lies in different forms of expression, different approaches to creation, different connections with human experience. The director in the control room spoke quietly into his headset. "Keep the two shot. This is incredible." Sensing they were capturing something rare, something genuine, something potentially more Meaningful, more engaging, more significant than the manufactured confrontation they had planned, the intellectual spectacle they had expected to present. Bennett cleared his throat slightly, professional enough to recognize when strategy needed to change, when approach needed to shift, when the predetermined script needed to be abandoned in favor of something more responsive, more authentic, more present to the conversation actually unfolding. "So you're suggesting, Stallone," he said, his tone carrying less certainty than before, less authority, less finality, that critical standards should be abandoned in favor of popular sentiment, emotional response, therapeutic benefit of creative work. It was another attempt at reductive framing, but Stallone shook his head, not accepting. The characterization, "No, Marcus, that's not what I'm suggesting at all," and with that everything changed.